Welcome to today's Explainer. We are about to unpack one of the most intense, dual-natured prophecies in the entire chronological Bible. We're diving into Zephaniah chapters 1 through 3, and let me tell you, we are exploring a massive narrative arc today. It swings wildly from this fierce, sweeping wrath all the way to the most profound, comforting joy you could possibly imagine.
But first, let's ground ourselves before we really get going. Hello everyone, this is TN Inside. Let's begin by reading today's scripture passage from the book of Zephaniah, chapters 1 through 3.
Okay, let's dive into our roadmap for today. We'll be moving purposefully through 5 key areas. First, a royal insider's warning. Second, the day of wrath. Third, judgment on the nations. Fourth, the rebellious city. And finally, we'll wrap up with a promise of joy.
Kicking things off with Section 1, a royal insider's warning.
Every great story needs a fascinating protagonist, right? Well, Zephaniah is exactly that. He isn't just some outside observer throwing stones at the establishment. He's a guy exposing deep-seated political and elite corruption from the inside out. And to really get him, you have to look at his name. Zephaniah literally translates to "the Lord hides" or "the Lord protects." Now, keep that tucked in the back of your mind as we go through this explainer, because this definition powerfully foreshadows the ultimate survival and protection of God's remnant that we're going to see later on. It's kind of like the ultimate spoiler is built right into his very name.
And his background is super interesting. When you look at other prophets like Micah, for instance, his focus was deeply intertwined with the daily struggles of the common people. But Zephaniah? Completely different story. He was actually a direct descendant of King Hezekiah, making him a royal figure himself. Because of that, he was deeply concerned with the royal family and these top-level political issues. This brilliantly illustrates his unique status. He was a royal insider who could vividly and accurately call out the corrupt state of the royal court and the nobility from firsthand, everyday experience.
So, let's map out exactly when all this is going down. We are right in the era of King Josiah. If you know your history, you'll remember Josiah was the one known for carrying out this massive, strong reformation centered completely around the temple. And historical records note that Zephaniah's powerful internal critiques very likely influenced that exact reform movement. He was essentially the voice in the king's ear, really pushing for that spiritual cleanup.
Which brings us to a much heavier topic, Section 2, the day of wrath.
So despite Josiah's best efforts at reform, there was this devastating underlying spiritual rot still infecting Judah. And we really need to understand exactly what provoked God's fierce wrath here. The spiritual state of Judah at this time was just absolute chaos. They weren't just dabbling in bad habits. They were completely immersed in foreign religions. You had people worshiping Baal, hoping for better crop production and childbirth. They were bowing down to Molech or Malcham, an Ammonite god worshipped through the literally horrific practice of child sacrifice. And they were obsessing over celestial bodies, worshiping the sun, the moon, the stars. It was a violent, chaotic, completely corrupted spiritual landscape. And this rampant idolatry and deceit, that is exactly what sparks God's intense anger.
And the consequence of all this? It's what the text ominously calls the day of the Lord. Now, Zephaniah does not mince words here. He describes this not as a day of light, but as a fixed day of wrath, distress, ruin, devastation, darkness, gloom, and battle. God declares he's going to completely sweep everything from the face of the earth. And I really want to emphasize the severity of this warning. This impending judgment is specifically targeted at those whose consciences have become completely hardened. The kind of people who sit back complacently and falsely claim, "Oh, the Lord will do nothing, either good or bad." They totally thought God was indifferent. But Zephaniah is stepping up to warn them, absolutely not. He is paying attention.
Let's move to and see how this builds in Section 3, Judgment on the Nations.
We need to zoom out geographically for a second, because this judgment, it doesn't just neatly stop at Judah's borders. It escalates way out to encompass all the surrounding nations. We see a highly specific, pronounced judgment for every major surrounding power. Philistia, including cities like Gaza and Ashdod, completely uprooted. Moab and Ammon, God hears their mocking and declares they will be made exactly like Sodom and Gomorrah. Cush, or Ethiopia, is to be destroyed. And even Assyria, the great, terrifying superpower of the day, will be wiped out, with its mighty capital Nineveh turned into nothing but a desolate wasteland. These nations represent all the nations on earth, showing just how universal the scope of God's judgment truly is.
Now, you might be wondering, why this massive global fallout?
Well, the text makes it crystal clear. These nations are being punished for hundreds of years of oppressing and afflicting God's people, for totally rejecting God, and for worshiping false idols. But there's an ultimate purpose to all this destruction. It isn't just mindless anger. When this judgment falls, all the people of the earth will finally recognize His power. Those false idols are going to be shattered, and the nations will be forced to recognize and worship the Lord as the one true God.
Zooming back in now to Section 4, the rebellious city. So let's bring our focus from the global stage right back to the heart of the matter, the remnant of Jerusalem. The text calls it the rebellious, polluted, and oppressive city, and the indictment against its leadership is just tragic. First, the city listens to no voice and accepts literally zero correction. It absolutely refuses to trust its God. Second, the prophets, the very people supposed to speak for God, are reckless and treacherous. And third, the priests are actively profaning the sanctuary and violating the law. Talk about a tragic irony, right? God and Judah were in a covenant relationship. God showed them grace. But the religious leaders themselves were the ones leading the rebellion and breaking that very covenant.
And to really drive home how deep this rebellion went, look at this stark, daily contrast. On one hand, you have God's justice. He is righteous and just, showing His justice each and every morning without fail. But contrast that with the wicked and corrupt leadership who literally rise each morning specifically to do evil. Think about that daily friction. This contrast perfectly explains why God's wrath is described as a fire of jealousy that will consume the whole earth. Light and darkness just cannot coexist like this forever without reaching a breaking point.
But here is where everything completely flips. Section 5, a promise of joy.
Right when the destruction seems absolute, right in the face of the imminent destruction of Judah by Babylon, Zephaniah hits us with a major narrative twist. He never loses faith. We swing from absolute desolation to this astonishingly bright, almost festive conclusion. Out of the literal ashes, God reveals a clear-cut restoration plan. Step 1, He will actively purify the lips of the people so they can call on the name of the Lord again. Step 2, they are going to serve Him shoulder to shoulder in total unity. And step 3, He will leave behind a humble and lowly people who do no wrong and speak no lies. God is actively purifying and gathering a humbled remnant to bring them back home. Even in the worst of it, those who fear the Lord will not be destroyed.
So, the crucial point we really need to take away is summarized in this breathtaking promise from Zephaniah 3:17. The Lord your God is with you, the mighty warrior who saves. He will take great delight in you. In His love, He will no longer rebuke you, but will rejoice over you with singing. Just pause and let that sink in for a second. The mighty warrior isn't just sparing them. He is actively rejoicing over them with deep, profound emotion. He's celebrating them as if it's a massive festival day, turning all their sorrow into joy and all their despair into this brilliant, undeniable hope.
And that brings us to the number 70. This number is huge. It represents the 70 years of bitter captivity in Babylon that the people of Judah eventually had to face. But here's the amazing thing. They were able to endure those 70 long, hard years solely because of prophets like Zephaniah. Because God continually revealed His heart and this profound promise of hope, assuring them that He would rejoice when they finally repented and returned to Him. It was this exact vision of the future that kept them going through the darkest decades of their history.
Which leaves us with one final provocative thought. How can we embody the humble remnant today in order to experience this promised joy and protection in our own lives? You know, Zephaniah's world was ancient, but that choice between hardened rebellion and humble seeking, that's something we face every single morning. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll leave you to reflect on that powerful question.